Just let me know.
Right about here, in Dallas, Texas, American President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. The accused assassin was a man named Lee Harvey Oswald. After being held in custody for less than 2 days, Oswald himself would meet a violent end. According to a subsequent investigation, Oswald had fired 3 rounds from the Texas schoolbook depository. Police recovered 3 shell casings and a bolt-action rifle from the 6th floor of the building. But the shooting of Oswald sparked immediate suspicions of conspiracy. Suspicions that persist to this day and have driven most Americans to reject the government's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. The arguments for and against conspiracy take many shapes and forms. Far too many, in fact, to do them all justice in a single video. Instead, in this video, I want to zoom in and focus on a very narrow slice of this case. Specifically, the events surrounding the Texas schoolbook depository. What exactly happened inside this building from where the shots that killed the president are believed to have been fired. In September of 1963, a young man named Wesley Frazier received a call from an employment agency. There was a potential job opening at the Texas schoolbook depository. On September the 13th, Frazier made his way from Irving, Texas, down to central Dallas. He met with Roy Truly, the superintendent of the building, and was hired on the spot. Back in Irving, Frazier lived with his older sister, Leanie Randall. A few houses down the street lived a woman named Ruth Payne. On October the 14th, both Randall and Payne had a cup of coffee at the house of a neighbor. Payne brought along a friend and Russian immigrant named Marina Oswald, the wife of Lee Oswald. Marina could barely speak any English and had been staying with Payne for a few weeks, partly due to her husband's unemployment.
The subject of Lee looking for work and that he hadn't found work for a week came up while we were having coffee. And Mrs. Randall mentioned that her younger brother, Wesley Frazier, thought they needed another person at the Texas schoolbook depository where Wesley worked.
Payne and Marina returned home, spoke with Roy Truly over the phone, and secured a job interview on behalf of Lee Oswald. The following morning, he went down to the book depository and began his first day of work on October the 16th. So, an acquaintance with whom Oswald's wife was currently staying had a casual conversation with a neighbor. That neighbor happened to have a brother who recently got employed at the book depository. This prompted his wife to ask the acquaintance to call the superintendent of the building to inquire about any vacancies.
I told Mrs. Payne that to send Oswald down and I would talk to him, that I didn't have anything in mind for him of a permanent nature, but if he was suited, we could possibly use him for a brief time.
The position was not only temporary, but only existed due to a temporary shortage of staff.
It was the end of our fall rush. If it hadn't existed a week or 2 weeks longer, or if we had not been using some of our regular boys putting down this plywood floor, we would not have had any need for Lee Oswald at that time, which is a tragic thing for me to think about.
But it gets even more tragic because Oswald was not the only one to apply for a job.
I might have sent Oswald to work in a warehouse 2 blocks away. Oswald and another fellow reported for work on the same day, and I needed one of them for the depository building. I picked Oswald.
If Oswald was somehow entangled in a conspiracy, and the aim of that conspiracy was for him to become employed at the book depository, this roundabout sequence of events is a very strange way to go about it. As the name implies, the Texas schoolbook depository was in the business of selling books. For $1.25 an hour, Oswald's job was to prepare the books for shipping. He did so by filling out forms and transporting cartons of books between the upper floors and the first. The building had 3 elevators, 2 staircases, and was 7 stories tall. In the northwest corner, 1 stairway and 2 freight elevators provided access to all 7 floors. A small passenger elevator near the front entrance stopped at level 4, while stories 1 and 2 were connected by a second flight of stairs. Lacking a driver's license, Oswald relied on Wesley Frazier to carpool between Irving and Dallas every Friday evening and Monday morning. He spent workdays at a rooming house in Dallas while spending the weekends with his wife and daughters in Irving. But on Thursday morning, November the 21st, the day before the assassination, Oswald decided to deviate from this routine.
I was standing there on the first floor getting the orders in, and Lee said, "Could I ride home with you this afternoon?" And I said, "Sure, like I told you. You can go home with me anytime you want to. Like I say, anytime you want to go see your wife, that is all right with me." Lee had never gone home in the middle of the week before, so I asked him why, and he stated that he was going home to get some curtain rods for his apartment. I asked if he was going home on Friday as well, and he said no.
Frazier drove Oswald back to Irving, where he arrived unannounced at the household of Ruth Payne. Both Payne and Marina were surprised to see Oswald on a Thursday. They assumed he'd come to make amends with Marina due to an argument they had had a few days before.
Did your husband give any reason for coming home on Thursday?
He said that he was lonely because he hadn't come the preceding weekend and he wanted to make his peace with me.
Was anything said about curtain rods or his taking curtain rods to town the following day?
No, I didn't have any.
He didn't say anything like that.
No.
The next day, Oswald said goodbye to his wife and left the Payne residence about 7:15. Atop a dresser in the bedroom, he left behind his wedding ring. Oswald was next seen walking down the street by Lenny Randall, carrying a package. He was soon joined by Frazier, and the two of them took a seat in his car to begin their commute.
When you got in the car, did you say anything to Oswald, or did he say anything to you?
I noticed there was a package lying on the back seat. I didn't pay too much attention, and I said, "What's the package, Lee?" And he said, "Curtain rods." And I said, "Oh yes, you told me you were going to bring some today."
Not only was Oswald carrying a large package, but he'd forgotten to bring a lunch bag.
When he rode with me, I say he always brought lunch, except that one day on November 22nd. He didn't bring his lunch that day. Right when I got in the car, I asked him where was his lunch, and he said he was going to buy his lunch that day.
They arrived in Dallas a few minutes before 8 o'clock. Typically, they would walk together from the parking lot to the book depository. But on this particular Friday, Oswald grabbed his curtain rods and rushed ahead into the building. Working on the ground floor, in view of the rear entrance, was their colleague, Jack Doherty.
Did you see Oswald come to work that morning?
Yes, when he first came into the door.
Did he have anything in his hands or arms?
Well, not that I could see of.
Frazier and Doherty are the only 2 people known to have seen Oswald entering the building. Frazier says he was carrying a package. Doherty says he was not. Contradictions like this one will become a recurring theme throughout the rest of this video. We'll take a closer look at the missing curtain rods in a later chapter, but for now, let's stay with Oswald. As the morning progressed, Oswald was seen working as normal. Roy Truly described him as an above-average worker who mostly kept himself. In fact, he was a bit of a mystery to his colleagues.
On the way back and forth between Irving and Dallas, did you talk very much to each other?
No, sir, not very much. He was one of these types that just didn't talk.
I was acquainted with Lee Oswald during the time he was employed at the book depository, but I never did get to know him well. He did not mix with the other employees and did not appear to want to make friends with me or any of the others.
Did you ever speak to Oswald?
Yes, sir.
Did he ever speak to you?
No, sir.
He never replied to you?
No, sir.
Would you say he was unfriendly?
Yes, sir, I would.
But there were exceptions to his reticence, and one of them occurred on this Friday morning. James Jarman was working on the ground floor when he observed Oswald staring at the window facing Elm Street.
Oswald was standing up in the window, and I went to the window also, and he asked me, what were people gathering around the corner for? And I told him that the president was supposed to pass in the morning, and he asked me did I know which way he was coming. And I told him, yes, he'll probably come down Main and turn on Houston, and then back again on Elm. Then he said, oh, I see. And that was all.
It's a brief yet fascinating moment. It almost seems as though Oswald had no idea that Kennedy would pass by the book depository. This was indeed the case for some of his colleagues. Jarman himself had only been made aware of the fact shortly before he spoke with Oswald. There's no doubt that Oswald knew the president was coming to Dallas, but whether he knew the route of the motorcade is much more difficult to prove. The route of the motorcade had only been finalized a few days before the visit and hinged upon its destination. Kennedy was supposed to attend a banquet in Dallas, but no one could agree on a venue. It came down to two options: the Trade Mart northwest of downtown or the Women's Building to the east. One of the more vocal proponents of the Trade Mart was Texas Governor John Connally, and after much back and forth, he finally got his way on November the 14th. Had the Women's Building been selected, the motorcade would have sped through Dealey Plaza east on Main Street, significantly further away and perpendicular to the book depository. Not to mention that First Lady Jacqueline would have been seated between the building and the president. The selection of the Trade Mart meant that the motorcade would now head west on Main Street and make these turns through Dealey Plaza to reach the northbound lanes on the freeway. Now, these turns could still have been avoided had the motorcade continued like so and not taken the freeway, but since the freeway was the more scenic and expedient route, it was the more attractive choice. All of that is to say, the success of the assassination was largely dependent upon the selection of the Trade Mart. It might therefore be tempting to cast suspicion upon Governor Connally, but it should be noted that he rode in the presidential limousine along with the Kennedys and suffered grave injuries during the shooting. Not only that, but Connally was actually opposed to a motorcade and favored a more direct route from the airport to the Trade Mart, a brief trip that would have bypassed Dealey Plaza altogether. He was unfortunately overruled by Kennedy himself, who wanted to see and be seen by the people of Dallas. Okay, so all that was happening behind the scenes, but as far as the public was aware, there wasn't even going to be a motorcade. As late as November the 15th, the Dallas Morning News reported that a motorcade seemed unlikely. But the very next day, the parade was finally confirmed. While the precise route followed by maps and detailed descriptions was not officially disclosed until November the 19th, someone familiar with Dallas could have approximated the route a few days in advance. That is to say, the earliest point a member of the public could have deduced that Kennedy would be driven past the book depository was November the 16th, less than a week before the visit. There's a good chance that Oswald saw these articles because he'd been observed reading political columns in the very same newspapers. Furthermore, we know from other aspects of Oswald's life that he was politically inclined.
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries.
Oswald's colleagues remained oblivious to the motorcade. So while it's understandable for someone apolitical to be taken off guard by a presidential visit, it makes far less sense for someone like Oswald.
On November 21st, the day before the assassination that you were describing, was there any discussion between you about President Kennedy's trip or proposed trip to Texas, Dallas, and the Fort Worth area?
I asked Lee whether he knew where the president would speak and told him that I would very much like to hear him and to see him. I asked him how this could be done, but he said he didn't know how to do that and didn't enlarge any further on the subject.
Had there ever been...
This was also somewhat unusual, his lack of desire to talk about that subject any further.
How did you think it was unusual? Could you explain that?
The fact that he didn't talk a lot about it. He merely gave me said something as an answer, and did not have any further comments.
Do you mean by that, usually he would discuss a matter of that kind and show considerable interest?
Yes, of course. He would have told me who would be there and where this would take place.
We'll never know what Oswald was thinking when he spoke with James Jarman shortly before the assassination. But it is worth repeating, though, that Oswald was hired on October the 15th. That's a full month before the motorcade route had been decided, let alone announced to the public. On the morning of November the 22nd, a handful of employees had been assigned to install a new plywood floor on the 6th floor of the book depository. Every once in a while, they would catch a glimpse of Oswald.
I saw Lee Oswald shortly before lunchtime. He was by himself with a piece of paper in his hand. I had nothing to say to him, but some of the other male employees teased him and told him he ought to go get a haircut. Lee Oswald just laughed at this remark.
Shortly before noon, it was time for lunch. For a bit of fun, they decided to race the two elevators down to ground level. As they began descending, they observed Oswald now standing on the 5th floor. He shouted for them to stop or to close the gate to the elevator upon reaching the 1st floor. Charles Givens then realized he'd forgotten his jacket and cigarettes up on the 6th floor. About to return to ground level, Givens spotted Oswald approaching.
Lee was coming from the window up front where the shots were fired from.
Did you watch where he walked to?
Well, no, sir. I didn't pay much attention. I was getting ready to get on the elevator, and I say, "Boy, are you going downstairs?"
What did he say to you?
I say, "It's near lunchtime," and he said, "No, sir. When you get downstairs, close the gate to the elevator." That meant the elevator on the west side. You can pull both gates down, and it'll come up by itself.
What else did he say?
That is all. I said, "Okay," and got on the elevator.
And with that, Givens became the last person inside the book depository known to have seen Oswald before the assassination. At least, that's the official story. The encounter was fixed at 11:55, more than half an hour before the shooting. But other employees claimed to have seen Oswald in other parts of the building around the same time or even later than Givens. Givens himself provided conflicting accounts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This encounter notwithstanding, Givens was not the last person to visit the 6th floor. Shortly after Givens had left, Bonnie Williams grabbed his lunch and went upstairs. He sat down right about here to await the president's arrival.
Now, when you were sitting by the window, could you see down towards the southeast corner?
No, sir. I couldn't see anything as I remember there. About the only thing that I could see from there would be the top edge of the window because the boxes were stacked up.
Did you see anyone else up there that day?
No, I did not.
The southeast corner is the location from where the shots that killed the president are believed to have been fired, the so-called sniper's nest. Williams says he was alone, but admits his view was obstructed by tall stacks of boxes. Meanwhile, down by the main entrance, someone was attempting to gain access to the building.
I met an elderly white man at the entrance of the building who asked me to direct him to a restroom. The man was very old and feeble and could hardly make it up the steps. About 5 minutes later, I saw this man leave the building and enter an old Buick automobile with 3 elderly white women. The Buick then drove away.
Did you see him talk to anyone in the building?
No, he went straight out.
This individual was never identified and is the only unknown person known to have entered the book depository before the shooting. After finishing his lunch up on the 6th floor, Bonnie Williams heard the voices of James Jarman and Harold Norman emanating from the floor below. Feeling a bit lonely, Williams went down to the 5th floor and joined his 2 colleagues. The exact time of Williams' departure is unclear, but it was likely no more than 10 or even 5 minutes before the shooting. On the grounds below, a sea of spectators lined the streets of Elm and Houston. Every once in a while, one of them would glance up at the book depository. Indeed, Jarman, Williams, and Norman were spotted on multiple occasions, leaning out the far east windows on the 5th floor. But movement could also be seen on the floor above them, a floor that, by all accounts, was now supposed to be empty. Awaiting the motorcade by the east curb of Houston was a young, newlywed couple named Arnold and Barbara Rowland. Some 15 minutes before the shooting, Arnold spotted a white man in the westernmost window on the 6th floor of the book depository. The man was holding a rifle, his gaze locked at Houston. Despite standing a few meters away from an officer, Arnold chose not to report the gunman.
Did it ever enter your mind that you should go and tell the policeman of this sight or this vision that you had seen?
Really, it didn't.
It never entered your mind?
I never dreamed of anything such as that. I mean, I must honestly say, my opinion was based on movies I have seen, on the attempted assassination of Theodore Roosevelt and the other one, Franklin Roosevelt. And both of these had Secret Service men up in windows or on top of the buildings with rifles. And this is how my opinion was based, and why it didn't alarm me. Perhaps if I had been older and had more experience in life, it might have made a difference. It very well could have. Do you ever have reoccurring dreams, sir?
What?
Do you ever have reoccurring dreams?
Yes.
This is a reoccurring dream of mine, sir. All the time. What if I had told someone about it? I knew about it enough in advance, and perhaps it could have been prevented. I mean, this is something which shakes me up at times.
If Rowland's recollection is accurate, it stands in direct conflict with that of Bonnie Williams, who claimed to have eaten lunch on the same floor at the same time. Williams neither saw nor heard anyone, despite having an unobstructed view down to the southwest corner of the building where Rowland claimed to have seen the gunman. A few minutes later, a different spectator named Howard Brennan spotted a white man pacing to and fro the easternmost window on the 6th floor. At 12:30, the presidential limousine emerged from behind a building and began driving north on Houston. As the car made a sharp left turn at Elm, a high school student named Amos Ewens glanced up at the book depository and caught sight of a protruding metal rod.